You're an old man who can barely hear his own doorbell, Walter. Nobody is going to believe a word you say." Derek said it loud enough for the entire backyard to hear, right in the middle of my granddaughter's 6th birthday party. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Behind me, the little motor in the drink cooler kept humming along, oblivious, the only sound left in a yard that had gone completely silent. My daughter's hand froze in midair. A birthday candle pinched between her fingers, never making it to the cake. To Derek Voss, I was nothing but an old dog too deaf to bark, a rusted tool he'd decided had outlived its usefulness and could be tossed in a bin behind the garage. My name is Walter Briggs. I am 63 years old. For 28 years, I trained federal law enforcement recruits how to survive the worst 3 seconds of their lives, how to read a room, how to spot the lie in a man's shoulders before it ever reached his mouth. I taught almost 4,000 agents and marshals how to stay alive, and on a warm Saturday afternoon in June, standing at the edge of my own daughter's yard with a paper plate of cake in my hand, I let my son-in-law believe none of that had ever happened. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought your silence meant you had nothing left to give, stay with me, because before this story is over, Derek Voss is going to learn exactly what that silence was hiding. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you believe family always comes before fear, hit subscribe before we go any further. It started 3 weeks earlier with a phone call at 11 at night. My wife Margaret was already asleep beside me when the phone lit up the dark bedroom, and I saw Emily's name on the screen. My daughter never called that late unless something was wrong. She was 34 years old, a landscape architect who'd built half the public gardens in 3 counties, a woman who didn't rattle easily. But her voice on the other end of that call was thin and folded in on itself. The voice of somebody trying very hard not to let a 6-year-old asleep in the next room hear her cry. "Dad," she whispered, "I think Derek's in trouble with money, real trouble. He won't tell me anything." And today he screamed at me in front of Lily for asking a simple question about the business account. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake Margaret, though I already knew from the stillness beside me that she wasn't asleep anymore either. 28 years of teaching young agents how to listen for the truth buried underneath what a person is actually saying had given me one skill I never fully retired from. I could hear fear even when somebody was trying to bury it politely. And what I heard in my daughter's voice that night wasn't a woman worried about a rocky marriage. It was a woman starting to be afraid of the man asleep down the hall. I want to tell you plainly, because it matters for everything that comes after. I am not a man who charges into other people's lives. For 6 years I had watched Derek Voss slowly narrow my daughter's world. The friends who stopped coming around, the landscaping contracts she quietly turned down because he didn't like her working late, the way she'd started apologizing for things that weren't her fault before anyone had even accused her of anything. I saw all of it, and I said almost nothing. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself she was a grown woman who could handle her own marriage, and that a father who inserted himself too far would only push his daughter further away. That was the story I told myself for 6 years, and I want you to remember I said that, because later in this story, sitting across from Emily at my own kitchen table, I am going to have to admit out loud that it was a coward's excuse dressed up as respect, and that my silence cost her more than I will ever be able to give back. But that night on the phone, I didn't say any of that yet. I just told her to get some sleep, and that her mother and I would see her at Lily's party in 3 weeks like we'd planned, and that whatever this was, we would figure it out together. I should tell you a little about who Derek Voss actually was before that phone call, because the man my daughter married 8 years ago is not entirely the same man who stood in that backyard calling me deaf. Derek ran a boutique real estate development firm out of a glass office downtown. The kind of place with an espresso machine that cost more than my truck and a lobby that smelled like money and ambition. He was 37, handsome in the practiced way of a man who had learned early that charm opens doors that patience never will. And for a long time I told myself Emily had simply married a driven man, nothing more sinister than that. What none of us knew, what I would only learn piece by piece over the following weeks, was that Derek's little firm didn't run on real estate commissions at all. It ran on the goodwill of a much larger, much quieter man named Victor Kane. On paper, Kane was a private investment partner, the kind of silent money man whose name appeared on almost nothing. In reality, Derek's entire company existed because Victor Kane needed a clean, respectable-looking front to move capital through, capital that came from places Victor Kane never wanted an auditor asking about. Derek wasn't the architect of anything. He was a doorman standing at the entrance of somebody else's very large, very dangerous house, and he had recently made a mistake that put his own name directly on the door. I didn't know any of that yet on the day of Lily's party. All I knew was that my daughter sounded frightened on the phone, and that when Margaret and I pulled into that driveway 3 weeks later, balloons tied to the mailbox and the smell of grilled hot dogs drifting across the lawn, something in the air of that house had changed since the last time we'd visited. Derek answered the door with a beer already in his hand at 2 in the afternoon, and his handshake lasted half a second, too short, the handshake of a man who has already decided you are beneath the effort of a real greeting. The party itself was small and sweet for the first hour. A bounce house in the side yard, 6-year-olds shrieking over a magician who kept losing his own rabbit, Emily moving through the crowd with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I noticed her flinch, just barely, every time Derek's voice rose across the yard, the way you'd flinch at a sound you'd learned to brace for without ever deciding to. I noticed, too, that I flinched at something myself that day, something nobody at that party would have understood. When the magician's assistant popped a stack of confetti cannons for the big finale, the sudden crack of them sent a hot white jolt straight through my skull, and for 3 or 4 seconds I couldn't hear anything but a high, thin ringing, couldn't see anything but the blur of balloons and children's faces moving without sound. Margaret's hand found my arm before anyone else noticed, steady and quiet the way she'd been steadying me for 11 years now. 28 years on an indoor firing range training young agents how to shoot straight under stress had left me with a hearing specialist's official diagnosis and an unofficial habit of avoiding fireworks, gunshots on television, anything that cracked without warning. It is not something I talk about. It is the one place where the man who trained 4,000 agents to keep their composure cannot always keep his own, and I have spent years being privately embarrassed by it. I want you to remember that moment too, because it matters later. Because the man everyone in that yard saw as unshakable had a crack running straight through him that afternoon, same as anybody else. It was cake time when it happened. Emily was lighting the candles, Lily bouncing on her toes beside the table, and I made the mistake of asking Derek, quietly, gently, the way you'd ask a son a private question at a party, whether everything was all right with the business. I asked it because Emily had asked me to, weeks earlier on the phone, because she was too afraid to ask him herself anymore. Derek's face changed instantly. The charming host evaporated, and something colder slid into place behind his eyes. "You're an old man who can barely hear his own doorbell, Walter," he said, loud enough that 3 separate conversations around the yard stopped mid-sentence. "Nobody is going to believe a word you say." That was the line. That was the moment the whole yard went still, the drink cooler humming on behind me into a silence so complete I could hear the distant highway a half-mile off. Emily's hand stayed frozen over the cake, the unlit candle trembling slightly between her fingers. Lily looked up at her father's face with the confused, searching expression only a child gives an adult who has just done something wrong that she doesn't have words for yet. He wasn't finished. Derek set his beer down on the picnic table, hard enough to slosh foam over the rim, and stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell the alcohol under the cologne. "You want to know what's going on with the business?" he said, his voice dropping into something meaner, something aimed only at me now. "Here's what's going on. If your daughter keeps asking questions she has no business asking, I will make sure this custody arrangement gets very ugly, very fast. I will tell a judge she's unstable, that she's been drinking, that she's not fit to keep Lily overnight. And you," he jabbed a finger toward my chest without quite touching me, the gesture of a man who has learned exactly how close he can get to a line without crossing it in public, you're going to sit there in your recliner and your hearing aids, and you're going to do absolutely nothing about it, because that's all you've ever done. I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. 28 years of standing across a mat from panicking 23-year-old recruits had taught me that the worst thing you can do in front of an escalating man is give him the reaction he's fishing for. I simply looked at him, and I said, quiet enough that only he and Emily could hear it clearly, "Derek, you should go inside and get some water." He laughed, a short, ugly bark of a laugh, and turned back to the party like he'd just won something. A few of the other parents busied themselves suddenly with paper plates and juice boxes, the particular kind of busy people get when they've just witnessed something they don't want to have witnessed. Emily lit the candles with shaking hands. Lily blew them out and nobody sang the second verse. We left 45 minutes later, earlier than we should have, Margaret hugging Emily too long at the car while Lily waved a sparkler someone had lit for her out on the driveway. On the drive home, Margaret didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes, which for a woman married to me for 36 years is its own kind of alarm bell. When she finally spoke, she asked me the question I'd been asking myself the whole way down that dark county road. What did he mean, Walter, about the custody arrangement getting ugly? They're not even talking about divorce yet. I didn't have an answer for her that night, but 3 days later, I got one. And it came in the form of a thick manila envelope taped to Emily's front door, the kind of envelope that changes the temperature of a house the moment it's opened. Emily called us over that same afternoon, and when Margaret and I walked into her kitchen, my daughter was sitting at the table with the papers spread out in front of her like something that might bite. Derek wasn't home. Lily was upstairs watching a movie with the volume turned up loud, the way children do when the adults in the house need them somewhere else. Emily's hands were shaking as she slid the papers across the table toward me, and I watched her face while I read. Because I have learned over the years that you can tell almost as much from how someone waits as from what they've been handed. It was a filing from a family law attorney, one of the more aggressive names in the county, a man Derek's company had clearly paid a great deal to move fast. The petition sought emergency modification of custody, citing, and I remember the exact phrasing because I read it 4 times before I trusted myself to speak, concerns regarding the mother's financial instability, erratic behavior, and misuse of marital assets, including unauthorized transfers from company accounts totaling approximately $41,000 over the preceding 8 months. Emily was already crying by the time I looked up. "I never touched his business accounts, Dad. I don't even have access to them. He's going to tell a judge I stole money, and I have no idea where any of this is even coming from." I set the papers down slowly on the table, and for the first time since that phone call 3 weeks earlier, I let myself feel the full weight of what I already suspected, that whatever mistake Derek Voss had made in his own business, whatever hole he had dug for himself with people far more dangerous than a family court judge, he had decided the fastest way to climb out of it was to bury my daughter in it instead. Margaret reached across the table and took Emily's hand, the same steady grip she'd used on my arm at the party 3 weeks before, and I sat there for a long moment listening to the movie, playing upstairs, some cheerful cartoon song drifting down through the floorboards while my daughter's marriage and possibly her freedom were laid out on the kitchen table in front of us in 12-point font. I want to tell you that in that moment I already had a plan, that some old dormant instinct switched on and I knew exactly what to do next. That would make a better story. The truth is I sat there feeling every one of my 63 years, feeling the particular helplessness of a father who has spent decades teaching other people's children how to survive dangerous men, and had somehow never thought to teach his own daughter what to watch for in the one who slept beside her. But underneath that helplessness, something else was starting to stir, something I hadn't used in a long time, because reading through that filing a second time, past the panic, my eyes caught on something Derek's very expensive lawyer either hadn't noticed or hadn't cared about. The filing referenced a specific holding entity, a small limited liability company registered under a name I did not recognize, listed as the source of the disputed funds. And down at the bottom of the second page, buried in a footnote about the company's registered agent, was a name I hadn't heard spoken out loud in almost 11 years: Victor Kane. I sat very still at that kitchen table, the cartoon song still drifting down from upstairs, and felt something cold and clear settle into place behind my ribs. The same feeling I used to get 28 years earlier, standing at the back of a training range watching a promising young recruit make his very first mistake, back before I knew that particular recruit would grow up to become one of the most careful, most dangerous men I would ever have the misfortune of teaching. Derek Voss had no idea whose name he'd just put his own signature next to. He had no idea that the man quietly bankrolling his collapsing little empire was somebody I had personally trained, 20 years earlier, on a firing range not 40 miles from where we were sitting, back when Victor Kane still wore a badge, and still believed, or at least still pretended to believe, in exactly the kind of integrity I had spent my entire career trying to put into young men like him. I looked at Emily, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and I made a decision I should have made 6 years earlier. "Sweetheart," I said quietly, "I need you to tell me everything you know about the man your husband calls his business partner." Emily didn't answer right away. She got up from the table, walked to the counter, and poured herself a glass of water she didn't drink, the kind of motion people make when they need their hands to be doing something other than shaking. When she finally turned back around, her voice was steadier than I expected. "His name comes up sometimes," she said. "Victor. Derek never calls him by his last name in front of me, just Victor, like they're old friends. He calls late at night sometimes, and Derek always takes it in the garage with the door shut. I asked about him once, early on, and Derek told me Victor was the reason we had this house, the reason the company existed at all. He said it like I was supposed to be grateful." She wrapped her arms around herself. "About 4 months ago, Derek started sleeping badly, really badly. I'd wake up, and he'd be standing at the bedroom window at 3 in the morning just staring at the driveway. When I asked him what was wrong, he said Victor was disappointed in some numbers, and that I shouldn't worry about it. That was the same week he opened that LLC. He had me sign something at the kitchen table, told me it was just a formality for a tax filing. I didn't read it carefully, Dad. I trusted him. I signed it. I felt Margaret's eyes on me from across the table, and I knew she'd caught the same thing I had, that whatever Derek had asked Emily to sign 4 months ago, it was very likely the same document now being used against her, dressed up in a lawyer's language, as evidence of her own wrongdoing. I want to stop here and tell you something about Victor Kane, because you need to understand exactly who I was dealing with before I tell you what I did next. 20 years ago, before I ever became the senior instructor at the academy, I ran a much smaller training unit, 6 recruits at a time, out on a range in the Pine Woods about 40 miles from where I now sat at my daughter's kitchen table. Victor Kane came through that unit in his mid-20s, a sharp, hungry young man from a rough part of the city who had clawed his way into federal law enforcement through nothing but discipline and an almost frightening amount of ambition. Of the 6 recruits in that class, Victor was, without question, the most gifted. He read a room faster than men twice his age. He could de-escalate a screaming drunk in under a minute and calculate a tactical approach to a barricaded structure just as fast. I used to tell Margaret I thought I was training the future director of the entire service. At the end of that training cycle, there's a small tradition we kept, nothing official, nothing in any manual. I gave each graduating class a coin. Not government issue, nothing that would ever show up on an inventory sheet. I had them made myself, out of my own pocket, a simple brass medallion with 4 words stamped into the face: "Integrity is the only badge." I gave Victor Kane his coin personally, shook his hand, and told him he had more raw talent than anyone I'd trained in a decade, and that talent without integrity was the most dangerous thing in the world. He'd looked me dead in the eye and told me he understood exactly what I meant. I believed him completely. 11 years ago, Victor Kane resigned from federal service under circumstances that were never fully explained to me and disappeared from my life the way former students sometimes do, a name that occasionally surfaced in conversation with old colleagues, always accompanied by a slight shake of the head, a sense that something had gone wrong that nobody wanted to say out loud. I heard secondhand that he'd gone into private security consulting. I heard later quieter rumors that consulting was doing a great deal of heavy lifting in that sentence. I never confirmed any of it myself. I never wanted to. Some part of me, I think, preferred not knowing, the same way you'd rather not know if an old friend's marriage was falling apart behind a smiling front door. Sitting in Emily's kitchen with that custody filing in front of me, I finally let myself put the pieces together I'd spent 11 years quietly avoiding. Victor Kane hadn't disappeared into some ordinary private security career. He had built, slowly and carefully, a network of small, respectable-looking businesses that existed for exactly one purpose: laundering money for people who could never let their names touch a bank record. And somewhere along the way, my son-in-law had walked willingly into that network, probably believing, the way ambitious young men always believe, that he was smart enough to take the money and stay clean of everything it was attached to. Derek Voss had made a mistake. I would learn, over the next several days, exactly what that mistake was. But that afternoon, all I knew was that my daughter's freedom and my granddaughter's safety were now tangled up with a man I had once shaken hands with and called promising, and that gave me something almost nobody else in that situation would have had. I knew how Victor Kane thought. I knew what he valued, and more importantly, I knew exactly what he had once claimed to value most. That night, after we'd driven Emily and Lily back to our house, I wasn't about to leave them alone under that roof with Derek due home any hour. I went out to the garage after Margaret had gone up to bed, and I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I moved the old workbench away from the back wall, knelt down slowly on a knee that complains more than it used to, and opened the bottom drawer of a battered steel filing cabinet I hadn't touched since I retired. Underneath a stack of old training manuals and a folder of graduation photographs I hadn't looked at in years, I found the small wooden box where I kept the extra coins from that final class, the ones nobody had claimed. And there, resting exactly where I'd left it, was a photograph of 6 young recruits standing in a loose line on a dirt range. Squinting into a summer sun, Victor Kane, second from the left, 24 years old, grinning like a man who believed he could still become anything he wanted to be. I sat on an overturned bucket in that garage for a long time, holding that photograph, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, not anger, not yet, but a kind of grief. I had spent 28 years believing that if you gave a young man the right foundation, integrity would hold. Looking at that photograph, I had to admit to myself that I had been wrong about at least one of them, and that the man my daughter had married had somehow attached himself to the exact place where my own confidence had failed. Margaret found me out there past midnight. She didn't ask what I was doing. She just pulled up another overturned bucket, sat down beside me in the cold garage light, and put her hand over mine on top of that old photograph. The two of us silent for a long while, two people who had built 36 years together, mostly out of exactly this kind of quiet. "You're going to go see him," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "I don't know yet," I told her honestly. "But I think I'm the only person who can walk into that man's world and have him actually listen before he decides to bury us instead." She squeezed my hand. "Then you're not going alone into anything, Walter. You've spent 30 years teaching people how to stay calm walking into danger. You've never once had to teach yourself how to walk into it as a grandfather. Let me help you carry that part." That was the moment, if I'm honest, that the stiffness I'd been carrying since that kitchen table finally cracked. I am not by nature a demonstrative man. Margaret has told people for years that getting an unprompted hug out of me is like coaxing a barn cat out from under the porch. But sitting on that overturned bucket at 1 in the morning, the photograph of a 24-year-old Victor Kane still resting on my knee, I put my arm around my wife and held on to her longer than I had, in longer than either of us could probably remember, and neither of us said anything else for a while, because there wasn't anything left that needed saying out loud. The next morning, I did what I should have done the very first night. Emily called me. I picked up the phone and called an old colleague of mine, a woman named Dolores Reyes, who had spent 31 years as a forensic financial examiner before retiring 2 years ahead of me, the kind of examiner who used to make defense attorneys physically pale when her name appeared on a witness list. Dolores and I had trained together, drunk bad coffee together at 4 in the morning during a joint operation 18 years ago, and stayed close enough since then that she still sent Margaret a Christmas card every year with a photo of her ridiculous enormous poodle on the front. I told her everything, the custody filing, the LLC, Victor Kane's name buried in a footnote. Nobody but a paranoid old instructor would have caught. Dolores went quiet on the line for a moment, the particular silence of a professional recalculating a problem in real time. "Walter," she said finally, "I can't just go pulling records on a private citizen, because your gut says something's wrong, you know that. But I can tell you what any private examiner would tell you to do, and I can point you toward what's already public." She walked me through it. How Derek's holding company had filed its incorporation documents with the state, all of it a matter of public record if you knew where to look. How any competent examiner would start not with Victor Kane's private accounts, which no one outside a warrant could touch, but with Derek's own business filings, his commercial mortgage records, and the paper trail he'd left behind at his own company, all of it sitting in plain sight for anyone patient enough to read it properly. "And Walter," she added, "if this business really is what you think it is, there's almost always somebody on the inside who already knows, somebody who got nervous and quit before it blew up. Find that person before you ever think about knocking on Victor Kane's door." That single piece of advice turned out to be the most valuable thing anyone said to me during that entire ordeal, and it came, fittingly, not from some dramatic act of surveillance, but from an old friend telling me to do exactly what any honest person would do: look at what was already sitting in plain view and go talk to somebody who'd been brave enough to walk away. It took me 4 days of careful, unglamorous work to find her. Her name was Priya Nair, and she had worked as Derek's company bookkeeper for 2 years before, resigning abruptly 6 weeks earlier, right around the time, I would later learn, that Derek had first come to Victor Kane hat in hand, admitting he was short. I found her through nothing more sophisticated than the state's business registry and a handful of very polite phone calls, and when I finally reached her, sitting in a diner booth across from a woman perhaps 30 years old, with tired eyes and a coffee she kept turning in slow circles without drinking, I expected to have to convince her to talk to me. I didn't have to convince her of anything. "I've been waiting for somebody to ask," Priya said, before I'd even finished explaining who I was. "I quit because I found things in those books I couldn't unsee, Mr. Briggs. I didn't go to anyone because I was terrified. And because I didn't have proof of who I could even trust to bring it to. But I kept copies. I told myself I was keeping them to protect myself if it ever came back on me. Maybe I was really keeping them because some part of me knew somebody like you would eventually come asking." She reached into a canvas bag at her feet and set a small, worn leather ledger on the table between us. An old-fashioned accounting notebook, the kind Derek apparently still used for a private set of books he never let anywhere near his official accountant. Handwritten entries in his own cramped script tracking transfers that never once appeared in the company's real financial records. Numbers moving in from accounts with no discernible business purpose, moving back out within days to contractors that, as Priya explained quietly, didn't appear to have done any actual work. And there, 3 pages in, was an entry from 4 months earlier, the exact week Emily had described her husband standing at the bedroom window at 3 in the morning. A single line reading E. Voss, signatory, holding X account, per VK approval. I sat in that diner booth for a long moment, looking at my daughter's name written in my son-in-law's handwriting, sandwiched between numbers that had nothing to do with her, and felt the last of my hesitation burn away completely. "Will you make a copy of this for me?" I asked Priya quietly. "Not the original. I don't want you exposed any more than you already have been. But I need something I can bring to the right people. Something that shows exactly how she got put in that position without ever knowing it." Priya nodded, her hands finally steady for the first time since I'd sat down. "There's something else you should know," she said. "About 3 weeks ago, Before I left, I overheard part of a call. Derek was on the phone with Victor Kane, and he wasn't calm. He said if the money wasn't accounted for by the end of the month, Kane's people were going to want more than an apology. And Derek said, I remember this exactly, because it scared me enough that I started packing my desk that same afternoon. He said, I'll put it on my wife. Nobody's going to look twice at her. I drove home from that diner with the copied pages sitting on the passenger seat beside me like something radioactive. And for the first time since that phone call 3 weeks earlier, I understood the full shape of what was actually happening. This had never really been about a custody dispute at all. Derek Voss was drowning in a debt he owed to a very dangerous man, and rather than face what that debt might cost him, he had decided to hand my daughter to the current in his place, quietly, legally, on paper, in a way that would look, to anyone who didn't know better, like nothing more than an ugly divorce. He had made my daughter the fall guy for a crime she didn't know she was committing, and he had done it while borrowing, without ever knowing it. The trust of a man I had personally shaken hands with 20 years earlier, on a dirt range in the Pine Woods, believing with everything in me that I was sending a good man out into the world. I called Simon. No, I stopped myself, even in the privacy of my own head, because that wasn't right. That was somebody else's story, not mine. I called the one person I actually trusted with something this size. My old friend from the academy, retired federal financial examiner Dolores Reyes, and I told her what Priya had shown me. Dolores went quiet again on the line, longer this time. Walter, she said finally, what you're describing, if it's accurate, isn't a family court matter anymore. That's federal wire fraud and money laundering. And depending on who this Kane person really is, it may already be on somebody's radar. You need to be very careful about how you use what you have. Bring it to the right person the right way, or you risk burying your daughter deeper instead of digging her out. I know exactly the right person to bring it to first, I told her, looking down at Priya's copied pages spread across my kitchen table. I just have to hope he still remembers what I taught him. Margaret walked in as I hung up the phone, took one look at my face, and set down the 2 cups of coffee she'd been carrying. You found him, she said. It wasn't a question either. I found where he's hiding, I said. Now I have to decide whether I still believe there's enough of the man I trained left inside him to make this easier, or whether I'm about to walk into the house of somebody who's forgotten every single thing I ever taught him. I looked down at the brass coin I'd set on the kitchen table beside the ledger pages, the twin of the one I'd given Victor Kane 20 years ago. 4 words stamped into its worn face, catching the evening light through the window. Integrity is the only badge. I picked it up, closed my hand around it, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I let myself feel something other than fear for my family. I felt ready. 2 days later, I drove out to the address. Dolores had helped me to trace through public business filings, a squat, unmarked office building on the edge of an industrial park, the kind of building with tinted glass and no company name on the door. Exactly the sort of place a man builds when he wants to be found by no one who isn't already looking for him specifically. I sat in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I went in, turning the twin coin over and over in my hand, rehearsing 100 different opening lines and discarding every one of them. In the end, I didn't need any of them. The receptionist, a young man who clearly hadn't been told to expect visitors, buzzed a back office to announce me, and I heard through the thin wall a long silence followed by a voice I hadn't heard in 11 years say, "Send him back." Victor Kane's office was almost aggressively plain. No photographs, no diplomas, nothing personal at all. The office of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that leaving evidence of yourself anywhere was a liability. He stood up slowly when I walked in, and for a moment neither of us said anything. He looked older than his years, the way men do when they've spent a long time carrying something heavy in private. Whatever I'd expected to feel walking into that room, anger, maybe, or the cold satisfaction of finally having leverage over a dangerous man, what I actually felt, looking at him, was something closer to sorrow. "Instructor Briggs," he said finally, and something in the way he said it, using the old title instead of my name, told me more than any confession could have. I always figured this conversation would happen eventually. I just thought it'd be under different circumstances. You know why I'm here, I said. I set the ledger pages on his desk without preamble, not the original, a copy, exactly as I'd promised Priya, and let him look down at his own trusted associate's handwriting laying out, in black ink, exactly how Derek Voss had used my daughter's signature as cover for $81,000 he'd quietly siphoned off to cover a gambling debt. He'd been too proud and too frightened to admit to anyone, least of all the man he owed real money to. I watched Victor Kane's face while he read, and here is the thing I need you to understand, because it's the piece of this story that surprised me most. I expected to see a criminal calculating his next move. What I saw instead, for just a moment before he composed himself back into the careful blankness of a man who has trained himself never to react, was something that looked very much like shame. He told me the shortfall was a paperwork delay, Kane said quietly, still looking down at the pages. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I've had my suspicions about Derek for months, Instructor Briggs. I just didn't want to be right. He looked up at me then, and for a moment I saw, underneath 20 years and whatever this life had turned him into, the same sharp, hungry 24-year-old who had once shaken my hand on a dirt range and told me he understood exactly what integrity meant. I never authorized him to put your daughter's name on anything. That was his idea and his mistake. And I promise you, when I brought him into this business, protecting innocent people who had nothing to do with any of it was never supposed to be optional. That's a very convenient thing to say now that I'm standing in your office holding proof, I said. He didn't flinch from that, which told me something too. It's convenient timing, Instructor Briggs. It doesn't make it less true. He was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his mind. I need you to understand something else, and I'm only telling you this because of who you are to me, and because I owe you a debt I've never been able to repay. My own situation is not as simple as you think. I answer to people above me who have very little patience for exposure of any kind. If word gets back that Derek's carelessness has created a federal-sized problem, they will not wait around for a court date to solve it. They will handle it themselves, and men like Derek do not survive that kind of handling. I felt something cold settle in my stomach at that, understanding for the first time that whatever danger I'd walked into on my daughter's behalf, there was a version of this where Derek Voss ended up not in a courtroom but simply gone, and where the collateral damage of that kind of silence could reach a great deal further than a custody filing. Then help me end this the right way, I said. Not your way. The way that keeps my daughter and my granddaughter safe, and keeps this whole thing far away from a courtroom drama nobody in your world wants either. Kane looked at me for a long moment, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set something on the desk between us. A small, worn brass coin, its edges softened by 2 decades of being carried in a pocket, turned over by nervous fingers more times than either of us could count. Integrity is the only badge, still legible, still exactly as I'd stamped it 2 decades earlier. I've carried this every single day since the range, he said quietly. Some days it's the only thing that reminds me who I used to want to be. He pushed it slightly toward me, not giving it back, just letting it sit there between us, like a question neither of us was quite ready to answer. I can't undo what I've built, Instructor Briggs, but I can make sure the people I've already hurt without meaning to don't get hurt worse because of one desperate man's mistake. Give me 48 hours. I want to be honest with you and admit that I left that office not entirely certain whether I'd just made things better or infinitely more dangerous. I drove home turning that uncertainty over the whole way, and I didn't share the specifics of that meeting with Margaret or Emily that night, not out of secrecy, but because some part of me needed to sit with it alone first. The way you sit with a decision after it's already been made and can no longer be unmade. Derek found out about the meeting the next afternoon. I don't know exactly how, whether Kane told him directly, trying to force a confession before things spiraled further, or whether one of Kane's people mentioned it in passing. But by 6 o'clock that evening, my phone was ringing with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, Derek's voice came through so fast and so ragged, I almost didn't recognize it as the same man who'd humiliated me in front of 40 party guests 3 weeks earlier. "What did you do?" he said. And underneath the anger, I could hear something that sounded very much like panic. "What did you tell him? Do you have any idea what you've just started?" I stayed calm, the way I'd trained myself to stay calm for 28 years, standing across from young men on the edge of losing control. I also did something I want to explain plainly, because it matters for what happens later. I had, since the day Priya handed me that ledger, kept a simple recording application running on my phone for any call connected to this situation. My state allows a call to be recorded with the consent of just one party on the line, and I was that party, recording a call in which I had good reason to believe I might be threatened. I want to be clear about that because everything that came from this call, every second of it, was gathered the plain, legal way. A frightened old man protecting himself, nothing more dramatic than that. "I told him the truth, Derek," I said. "The same truth I'm about to tell a judge, unless you find a way to fix this yourself before that happens." "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice climbing. "If Kane thinks I'm a liability, I am dead, Walter. Do you understand that? Dead. And if I go down, I am not going down alone. I will make sure that custody filing looks like the least of your daughter's problems by the time I'm finished. I know where you live. I know Lily's school schedule. You want to play games with people you don't understand, old man. Fine. Let's play." The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen with the phone still in my hand, Margaret standing in the doorway, having heard enough of my end of the call to go pale, and for the first time since this entire thing began, I felt something shift inside me from careful strategy into something colder and more immediate. A desperate man with nothing left to protect is the most dangerous thing there is. And Derek Voss had just told me, in his own voice, on a recording I now had, exactly what he intended to do about it. I called Emily immediately and told her to bring Lily to our house that night and stay, no arguments. I called Dolores next and told her everything. The recording, the threat, the address he now knew for certain. She was quiet for a moment and then told me, in the flat, precise voice she used to use briefing federal task forces, exactly what I needed to do. Not hide, not run. Document, secure, and let the system that had been quietly built around Derek Voss over the past several days finally close. "You've already done the hard part, Walter," she said. "You found the evidence the right way. You have a legal recording of a direct threat. That's not something you handle alone in the dark anymore. That's something you hand straight to the sheriff's department tonight, and let them decide how seriously to take a man who just threatened a family with a minor child in the house." She was right, and I want to tell you I listened to her completely and did exactly the responsible, careful thing, and nothing else happened that night. But I would be lying to you if I pretended that after I filed the report with the sheriff's department, after 2 patrol units were dispatched to sit quietly at the end of our street as a precaution, I didn't also do one more thing that had nothing to do with any of Dolores's careful advice. I walked out to the garage, retrieved the old steel gun safe I hadn't opened since I retired, and made sure the shotgun inside it was clean, loaded, and exactly where I could reach it if every careful legal precaution in the world somehow still wasn't enough. Lily was asleep in the guest room by 9. Emily curled up on the couch beside her mother, both of them jumping at every sound, the old housemaid, settling into the night. I sat in my recliner by the front window, with the lights off, the coin from Victor Kane's office, still in my shirt pocket where I'd carried it since our meeting, and I waited. It was just past 11 when headlights swept across the front curtains, and a car I didn't recognize pulled slowly to a stop at the end of our driveway. My whole body went still in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with 28 years of training myself to notice exactly this kind of moment. I watched a figure get out of the driver's side, and even in the dark, even from that distance, I recognized the shape of him, the way he carried his shoulders, the particular restless energy of Derek Voss with nothing left to lose. He didn't come up the driveway. He stood at the end of it for a long moment, and then he did something I hadn't expected. He hurled something hard toward the house, not toward a window, thank God, but toward the mailbox. A rock wrapped in what I'd later find was a folded piece of paper, secured with a rubber band, the kind of clumsy, desperate gesture of a man too rattled to think clearly anymore. The crack of the rock against the metal mailbox in the silent night sent a jolt of pure white static straight through my skull, the same reaction I'd fought at Lily's birthday party 3 weeks earlier, and for a few long seconds, I couldn't hear anything past the ringing in my own ears. I want you to understand that even in that moment, even prepared, even trained, my own body still betrayed me for a handful of seconds, and I had to physically grip the arm of my recliner and breathe through it before I could move. By the time my hearing cleared, Derek was already back in his car, the taillights sweeping away down the dark road, and 30 seconds later, one of the patrol cars I'd requested pulled out from the shadows at the end of our street and followed him. I walked out to the mailbox in my bathrobe, Margaret right behind me with a flashlight, and picked up the rock with the note still rubber-banded around it. I unfolded it under the porch light with hands that were not, I'll admit, entirely steady. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, nothing like the careful signature I'd seen in Priya's ledger. You should have left this alone. Last warning. I stood there in the cold night air for a long moment, my daughter's shape visible through the front window. Sitting up now, watching us with her arms wrapped around herself, and I felt something in me that had been carefully, patiently controlled for 3 weeks finally settle into something entirely different. Not rage, exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than rage. A decision. He's not getting another chance to stand at the end of that driveway, I told Margaret, folding the note carefully to preserve it for the deputies who would be back within the hour to collect it as evidence. This ends now, the right way, in daylight, in front of people who can't be threatened into looking away. 2 days later, the custody hearing that Derek's lawyer had rushed onto the docket finally arrived. The same filing that had started this entire ordeal, still technically active despite everything that had happened since, because Derek, even now, hadn't withdrawn it. I think some part of him still believed he could bluster his way through a courtroom the same way he'd bullied his way through a birthday party. What he didn't know, walking in that morning in a suit that no longer fit him quite as confidently as it once had, was that he wasn't walking into a routine family court hearing anymore. He was walking into the exact center of everything closing in on him at once. The county courthouse smelled the way courthouses always do, floor wax and old paper, and the particular hush of people trying not to make their nerves audible. Emily sat between Margaret and me on a hard wooden bench outside courtroom 4, her hands wrapped so tightly around a folder of her own that her knuckles had gone pale. Lily was home with a neighbor for the day. Some things a 6-year-old doesn't need to sit through, no matter how carefully you explain them. I had not told Emily everything about my meeting with Victor Kane. I'd told her enough, that I'd found the person responsible for the missing money, that I had proof it wasn't her, that help was coming from a direction she wouldn't expect. I hadn't told her the name because some part of me was still holding my breath, still not entirely sure whether the man I'd once trained had a shred of that old integrity left in him, or whether his 48 hours would simply run out into silence. They didn't run out into silence. At 9:40 that morning, 20 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin, 2 things happened almost at once. The first was that Emily's attorney, a sharp, tired young woman named Farah Bello, who had taken the case on short notice as a favor to Dolores, came hurrying down the hallway with her phone still in her hand, telling us that Derek's own attorney had just filed an emergency motion to withdraw the custody petition entirely, citing in the driest legal language imaginable newly discovered information regarding the source and nature of the disputed funds. The second thing was that I looked up and saw, standing at the far end of the corridor, flanked by 2 men in plain gray suits who were unmistakably federal agents even from 30 feet away, Victor Kane. He didn't approach us. He simply nodded once, the smallest possible acknowledgement, the nod of a man closing a debt rather than opening a conversation, and then he was gone through a side door with the 2 agents, and I understood, watching him go, exactly what 48 hours had cost him. What I pieced together over the following days. Some of it from Dolores, who had contacts who could confirm the parts that mattered without ever compromising anything sensitive. Some of it from the local news coverage that broke 2 weeks later was this. Victor Kane had not simply decided out of old loyalty to fix Derek's mess quietly and disappear back into the shadows. He couldn't have, even if he'd wanted to, because Kane himself had been under pressure for months from a man above him in the network, a silent partner named Ronald Ashcroft who controlled the actual flow of the dirty capital, and who had grown increasingly suspicious that Kane's operation was becoming sloppy, exposed, a liability. Derek's clumsy attempt to cover his gambling debt by dragging Emily's name into a shell account hadn't just threatened my daughter. It had threatened Kane's entire standing with the man he answered to, and Kane had understood, faster than anyone, that the only way to survive Ashcroft's coming scrutiny was to get ahead of it, to quietly, voluntarily flag the irregularity to federal regulators through his own compliance attorney before Ashcroft's people found it first and decided Kane himself was the loose end that needed cleaning up. In other words, Victor Kane hadn't rescued my daughter out of the goodness of a reformed heart. He had done it to save himself, and the fact that saving himself happened to also mean saving Emily was, I came to understand, as close to redemption as a man that deep into that world was ever likely to get. I sat with that complexity for a long time afterward, and I want to be honest with you about it, rather than pretend it was simpler than it was. People are very rarely all one thing. Even the man who once shook my hand on a dirt range and meant every word of what he said about integrity had become someone capable of terrible compromises. And even in the middle of those compromises, some small, stubborn piece of the man I'd trained had apparently still been in there, waiting for a reason to do one true thing. Inside courtroom 4, the hearing that had been scheduled to determine whether my daughter was fit to keep custody of her own child lasted exactly 11 minutes. Derek's attorney formally withdrew the petition. The judge, a weathered woman who did not look like someone easily impressed by a room full of expensive suits, read the withdrawal notice twice, looked directly at Derek over the top of her glasses for a long, uncomfortable moment, and then addressed Emily's attorney to confirm there were no further motions before her. There weren't. It was over almost before it had properly begun, and Emily sat very still beside me through all 11 minutes, as if she didn't quite trust that the ground had actually stopped moving. What happened outside the courtroom afterward was not 11 minutes. It was considerably longer and considerably louder. Derek was waiting in the hallway. When we came out, his lawyer already several steps ahead of him, clearly wanting no further part of whatever was about to happen. He looked smaller than he had at that birthday party 3 weeks earlier, the confident swagger gone, replaced by the raw, cornered look of a man who has just watched every lever he thought he controlled get pulled out of his hands one at a time. He stepped toward Emily, and I moved without thinking, putting myself half a step in front of her, close enough that Derek stopped short. "You don't get to talk to her right now," I said quietly. "Not until federal agents finish talking to you first." "You destroyed me," he said, and there was real disbelief in his voice, the particular outrage of a man who has never once imagined the consequences of his choices catching up to him. "Over money you don't even understand. Over a business you have no idea how it works." "I understand it fine," I said. "I understand you tried to hand my daughter a crime she never committed, so you wouldn't have to face the consequences of your own. I understand that when a 6-year-old girl asked why her father was yelling at her grandfather, you didn't have an answer for her either." It was at that moment that a woman I didn't recognize stepped out from a cluster of people near the courtroom doors. Mid-60s, silver hair pulled back neatly, wearing the kind of tailored coat that told you she'd dressed carefully that morning for a fight she'd been dreading. She walked directly up to Derek, and I watched the color drain out of his face before she even spoke. "Mom," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, small and pleading, that told me this woman's opinion mattered to him more than anything a judge could have handed down. Deanne Voss did not look at her son with anger. Exactly. She looked at him with the specific, devastating disappointment that only a parent can carry, and she spoke loud enough that half the hallway heard it. loud enough that Emily's hand found mine and gripped it tight. I raised you better than this, Derek, she said. I did not raise a man who threatens a family with a small child in the house. I did not raise a man who lets a woman he promised to love stand in a courtroom accused of a crime he committed himself. She turned deliberately and took both of Emily's hands in her own, ignoring her son entirely now. I am so sorry, Emily. I should have said something to you months ago, when I first saw how he'd started talking to you. I told myself it wasn't my place. Her eyes flicked briefly to me, a flash of shared, uncomfortable recognition passing between two people who had each made the same mistake in their own way. That was a coward's excuse, and I won't make it again. Derek stood in that hallway, utterly alone. His lawyer already halfway to the elevator, his mother's back turned to him, federal agents visible through the frosted glass of a conference room down the hall, waiting to speak with him about matters considerably more serious than a custody filing. And I watched something in him finally break in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or bluster. He didn't say anything else. He simply turned and walked toward that conference room like a man walking toward a sentence he already knew was coming. I want to pause here and tell you about something that happened a few minutes later. Something small, something that didn't make the local news coverage 2 weeks after, but that mattered to me more than almost anything else that day. As we walked toward the courthouse exit, I noticed a handful of people rising from the gallery benches where they'd been sitting quietly through the whole proceeding, people I recognized. A young couple whose front yard Emily had redesigned for free the year their daughter went through chemotherapy, refusing to take a dime for the work. An elderly man from 3 streets over whose overgrown lot she'd cleared out one weekend after his wife passed, again, without charging him a cent, just because she'd noticed the yard had become too much for him to manage alone. A former co-worker Emily had quietly covered shifts for during a difficult custody battle of her own years earlier. None of them had been asked to come. None of them said very much. They simply stood near the courthouse doors as we passed, a loose, unplanned line of people who had shown up because my daughter had spent years being the kind of person who showed up for other people first, and I watched Emily's face as she recognized them one by one, watched her stop trying to hold back the tears she'd been fighting all morning. "You didn't have to come," she said to the older man, her voice thick. He just shook his head. "You cleared my whole yard in July heat and wouldn't take $1 for it, Emily. Standing here for an hour was the least I could do." That evening, back at our house, with Lily finally home and asleep, and the day's adrenaline slowly draining out of all of us, Emily and I sat alone on the back porch while Margaret got Lily settled for the night. For a long time, neither of us said anything, the two of us just watching the last of the daylight fade behind the tree line, the same quiet we'd shared 1,000 times over the years, without ever quite saying the things underneath it. "Dad?" Emily said finally. "How long did you know something was wrong with Derek before I finally called you that night?" I could have given her a comfortable answer. I could have told her I hadn't seen it, that none of us could have known. Instead, I made myself say the thing I'd been carrying since that first phone call 3 weeks earlier, the thing I'd promised myself I would eventually say out loud instead of just privately regretting. "Years, sweetheart," I said quietly. "I saw it start small, back when you stopped taking that contract with the Hendersons because he didn't like you working late. I saw it when you stopped going to your book club. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in your marriage, that a good father steps back and lets his daughter run her own life. That was true as far as it went. But underneath it, if I'm honest with you, I think I was also just afraid of what it would mean if I said something and you got angry with me, afraid of pushing you away instead of toward me. So I stayed quiet and I called it respect, and it wasn't respect at all. It was fear wearing respect's clothing. I should have said something the first time I noticed you apologizing for things that weren't your fault. I'm sorry it took him threatening your freedom for me to finally open my mouth." Emily was quiet for a long moment, and then she leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to when she was small. "Before any of this, before Derek, before any of the years neither of us could get back, I probably wouldn't have listened, Dad," she said softly. Not back then. I don't think I was ready to hear it, but I'm glad you're saying it now. She was quiet again, and then, in the particular unguarded way children sometimes have of cutting straight to the center of something adults spend paragraphs circling, Lily's small voice came from the screen door behind us. She'd woken up and wandered downstairs, still half in her pajamas, rubbing one eye. "Grandpa," she said, "is Daddy in trouble because he wasn't nice to Mommy?" I looked at my granddaughter standing in that doorway, 6 years old, asking the entire complicated weight of the last 3 weeks in a single simple sentence, and I found I didn't need to complicate my answer any further than she had. "Yes, sweetheart," I told her. "Being unkind to people you love has consequences, even for grown-ups. Especially for grown-ups." She considered that with the serious concentration only a 6-year-old can bring to a very large idea, nodded once as if filing it away for later, and asked if there was any birthday cake left in the fridge, and Emily laughed, really laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. And just like that, some of the weight that had been sitting on that porch all evening finally lifted enough to breathe around. The federal case against Derek Voss moved faster than any of us expected, in part because Priya Nair's ledger, along with the recording of Derek's threat and Victor Kane's own voluntary cooperation, gave prosecutors more than enough to work with, without ever needing to drag Emily into the middle of it as anything other than a witness who had been deceived. I sat down with Dolores Reyes a week later, and she walked me through, patiently and precisely, exactly what would and would not happen to my daughter, because I wanted to understand it clearly enough to explain it to Emily myself, in plain language, instead of legal jargon designed to frighten rather than inform. Derek was never in a position to sign away anything that belonged to Emily, because nothing in that shell account had ever legally been hers to begin with. The LLC's registered agent filing, once corrected through the state registry with the evidence Priya and Dolores had helped compile, formally removed Emily's name as an authorized signatory, a simple administrative correction rather than any dramatic courtroom surrender on Derek's part. What Derek did sign 3 weeks later, in a small conference room with his own attorney sitting grim-faced beside him, was a formal acknowledgement as part of his plea agreement, stating that Emily Briggs Voss had been added to the account without her informed consent or knowledge of its true purpose, and a separate agreement waiving any future claim or legal challenge against her regarding the matter. It wasn't cinematic. It was a stack of paperwork and a tired federal prosecutor reading terms aloud in a flat voice. But it was final, and it meant my daughter's name would never again appear anywhere near a case file that wasn't clearly, permanently marked as belonging to somebody else's crime. Derek pleaded guilty, eventually, to a reduced set of federal charges connected to wire fraud and structuring financial transactions to avoid detection. The plea agreement his attorney negotiated in exchange for cooperating fully against the larger network above him, testimony that would later help prosecutors build a much bigger case against Ronald Ashcroft and the operation he'd been running behind a wall of shell companies for the better part of a decade. Derek received 4 years in a federal facility with the possibility of an earlier release for continued cooperation. It was not the dramatic 60-year sentence of the kind of story where the villain vanishes forever into a concrete box. It was a smaller, sadder outcome, closer to the truth of most stories like this one, a man who had been arrogant and desperate and cruel, but who was, underneath all of it, exactly the kind of small, breakable person his mother's disappointment in that courthouse hallway had already told us he was. Victor Kane's fate, as far as I was ever able to learn, unfolded more quietly. Cooperating witnesses in cases of that size rarely have their names appear anywhere in the news coverage that follows, and Kane's did not. I never heard from him again after that single nod across the courthouse corridor, and some part of me suspects I never will. I don't know what became of him after that, whether the deal he made with federal prosecutors bought him a genuinely different life, or simply a different kind of quiet danger, further from Ashcroft's reach, but no closer to anything resembling the young man on that dirt range 20 years ago. What I do know is that the coin he handed back across his desk still sits in the small wooden box in my garage. beside its twin, and some evenings, when the house is quiet, I take both of them out and set them side by side on the workbench and think about how two men can be given the exact same 4 words to carry and end up walking such different distances from them. I don't think that's a story with a tidy moral. I think it's just the truth of people, and I've stopped needing it to be simpler than that. 2 months after the hearing, we held a small gathering in our backyard. Nothing large, nothing that would ever require a formal invitation, just Emily and Lily, Margaret and me, a handful of the same neighbors who had stood quietly outside that courthouse, and Diane Voss, who had, in the weeks since, become something none of us expected, a regular welcome presence in Lily's life, showing up on Saturday mornings with sidewalk chalk and a patience for her granddaughter's endless games that softened something in all of us to watch. It was not a celebration, exactly. Nobody used that word. It was closer to what Margaret called it when she was setting out the folding chairs that morning. A chance to just be a family again, out loud, in the daylight, without anybody flinching. Lily was chasing a soap bubble machine across the grass with 3 of her school friends when she suddenly stopped in front of my chair, out of breath, and asked me the kind of question only a 6-year-old thinks to ask at exactly the wrong, exactly right moment. "Grandpa, are you going to get scared again like at my party?" When the loud thing popped, the yard didn't go silent the way it had at that first birthday party 3 weeks earlier. Nobody froze. Margaret just smiled from across the yard where she was refilling lemonade, and Emily reached over and squeezed my hand once, gently, and I found to my own surprise that I didn't feel any of the old embarrassment I'd carried around that particular weakness for years. "Sometimes, sweetheart," I told her honestly, "my ears got hurt a long time ago doing important work, and loud surprises still catch me off guard sometimes. That's okay, though. Everybody's got something that catches them off guard. It doesn't mean you're not strong. It just means you're honest about it." She considered that with the same serious concentration she'd brought to her question on the porch weeks earlier, nodded once, and declared that she was going to warn her friends not to pop any balloons near me. And then she was gone again, chasing bubbles across the lawn, the whole conversation already behind her, the way important things sometimes are for children, held for exactly as long as they need to be, then set down and carried forward differently, lighter. I want to tell you something before I close this out, because I think it matters more than anything about ledgers or courthouses or federal agents in gray suits. The night of that backyard gathering, after everyone had gone home, and Lily was asleep and the yard was quiet again, Margaret and I sat out on the same back porch, where Emily and I had talked weeks earlier, and I found myself thinking not about Derek, or Victor Kane, or any of the danger that had passed through our lives over those difficult weeks, but about that single moment at the very beginning. Derek's voice cutting across a birthday party, telling a whole yard full of people that I was an old man too deaf to matter. He wasn't entirely wrong in a way I don't think he ever understood. I am an old man. My hearing is damaged, and it always will be. There are whole categories of sound the world makes now that I will never fully hear again, and there are moments, sudden, sharp, unexpected moments, where that damage will still catch me by surprise, no matter how many years pass. What Derek Voss mistook for weakness was simply the truth of a body that had given decades of itself to something larger, the same way every honest, hard-working person's body eventually shows the wear of the years they've spent showing up for the people and the work they cared about. What he never understood, standing in that yard so certain of his own advantage, is that being underestimated has never once been the same thing as being powerless. Quiet is not the same as absent. A man who has spent his life learning to read a room, to notice what other people overlook, to stay calm when everything in him wants to react. That man doesn't stop being dangerous to the people who threaten what he loves just because his hands have gone a little unsteady and his hearing isn't what it used to be. If anything, he becomes more dangerous because he has spent an entire lifetime learning exactly how much strength can be hidden inside patience. That is the only lesson I really want to leave you with tonight. More than any of the details about ledgers or coins or courthouse hallways, Somewhere in your life, there is very likely a person who has decided your quiet means you are weak. A person who mistakes your patience for permission, your restraint for an absence of power. Do not let them convince you they are right. The strongest people I have ever known in my life were never the loudest ones in the room. They were the ones who stayed calm long enough to see exactly what needed to be done, and then did it without ever needing anyone's permission to matter. A few weeks after that backyard gathering, I finally did something I'd been putting off since the night I first pulled that old photograph out of the garage filing cabinet. I had the picture reframed, the 6 young recruits squinting into a summer sun on a dirt range 20 years ago, and I hung it in my study, not to remember Victor Kane exactly, but to remember the man I'd been back then, the one who still believed, without complication, that if you gave people the right foundation, it would always hold. I don't believe that quite so simply anymore. But I believe something better now, something I don't think I could have understood 20 years ago, standing on that range handing out coins to young men who still had their whole lives ahead of them to decide who they wanted to become. I believe that even when the foundation cracks, even when the people you trained, or raised, or loved disappoint you in ways you never saw coming, there is almost always still time to choose differently. Derek Voss chose wrong, over and over, until the choosing was mostly taken out of his hands. Victor Kane chose wrong for a very long time, and then, when it finally mattered most, chose one true thing. And I chose silence for 6 years when my daughter needed my voice, and then, when it mattered most, I finally chose to speak. None of us get to go back and fix the years we spent choosing wrong. All any of us ever gets is the choice sitting directly in front of us, right now, today. I hope, whatever quiet thing you've been carrying, whatever room you've let someone convince you that you don't matter in, I hope you choose to speak up in it, before somebody has to threaten everything you love to make you finally find your voice. Some nights, when the house is quiet and Margaret's already asleep beside me, I still walk out to that garage, open the old steel filing cabinet, and take out the 2 matching coins resting side by side in their small wooden box. I hold them for a while, the way you hold something that reminds you of who you've been and who you're still trying to become, and then I put them away again and go back inside to the family that showed me, in the end, exactly what all those years of quiet training had really been for. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that patience is its own kind of strength, and that family is always worth protecting, subscribe to the channel and share your own story in the comments below. I read every single one.